Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Kim Burns. This is Introduction to Government and the Law, Chapter 1. Let's get started. So these will be our objectives for this chapter. So you can take a minute and read them, and then you can stop at any time, but we'll get started on these. So this is important. I'll have this at the beginning pretty much most chapter, and then for the state materials as well. Now this chapter is a little bit different than the other because this chapter doesn't really get into pharmacy practice content specific. So this is really some background information about our government and how the conflict of laws between states and federal. So this one, though, is really most of the information you need is on the slides. And there's going to be basically just a little bit of information in the book that is going to supplement really the slides. But for other chapters, it's going to be the textbook and the slides supplement the textbook. So just want to make sure I point that out to you. So these signed readings supplement this presentation. But again, that's just for this chapter. Now, the subheadings under a major heading are included as the assigned unless otherwise noted. So that's going to be when I give you a chapter heading, the master heading, the subheadings are going to be under there too as well. So the major heading, and then there's going to be some other ones, unless I note otherwise. Takeaway points after each section of the textbook that I say you should read, those are always very helpful. That doesn't mean those are everything within that heading, but it's a good way to self-assess yourself. So at the end, when you see those takeaway points, and if you can say, oh yeah, I completely understand what that means, that's a great way to self-assess yourself. And if you can discuss those points, that's a good way to do that. But again, make sure you understand that doesn't make up everything from that section. There are also study scenarios dispersed throughout the chapter after each major heading section. I may require you to do some of those throughout the chapters. We may cover some in class. There may be some that are some assignments as well. And then I also may encourage other topic headings to be read, as those could be tested on the MPJE, but I may not require them for the course, or I may not have them on the exam as well. Because they may be seen in practice, or you may have done them elsewhere in a different course or something like that. But I'll give you some guidance as we go. But for the federal part of the course, most things go by the headings in the test book. And then there's case studies at the end of each chapter. These are only for you if you want to read them. They're not going to be assigned. They are real life cases that have happened throughout the course of time. So basically they're historical cases, they're precedent, they're a good way to see actual cases that have happened that apply the information that we're seeing throughout the course. But we're not going to actually go through them and read them and talk about them. We just do not have the time. So, but you're more than welcome to read them to actually help you see how things have happened, cases in real life. And then the PowerPoint presentations do not contain all the information on them for exams. Now, chapter 1, I will say, again, most of the material that you need to know is on the slides. But again, you need to listen, you need to read. So it's not like you can just go memorize things. You still have to understand the things. I always encourage you to create study guides on readings, materials, presentations, discussions, scenarios, examples, put it all together. Okay, if you're looking to cram on just the presentations before the exams, that's not a good way to approach this class. So again, it's putting everything together. When you, again, see a specific heading in a chapter, the major ones that are not tested on, again, I'll provide you details. This may be on the slides. It could be exam specific and announced prior to the exam. For example, it could be something that we're covering in class and I could test on, but maybe after I write the exam, I might say to you, hey, I'm done writing the exam. Just to let you know, I didn't put any questions on this topic. I'm just letting you know that. So as you're studying, as it gets closer, you know, it's not that that topic isn't important. I'm just letting you know that that's not on there. I may do that. I may not. It just depends when I finish the test and how close it is. Okay. So I'll let you know that. But for sure, there's going to be some things I don't assign you that, again, aren't going to be on the test. Not that it's not important, just balancing the content that's on the test. And it's that you might have already had it elsewhere, or it's just something that I'm deciding at this point that I'm not going to test you on. All right, so let's talk about the U.S. Constitution. So this obviously is a very, very important document. You've probably had some kind of social studies course or U.S. history course throughout your time. So you've probably have a basic understanding of the U.S. Constitution. So here's some basic things to remember, or that you've already learned about it. It's in three parts: the preamble, the articles, and the amendments. It is the cornerstone of our government. It describes the structure of our federal government and the rights of the people. It is known as the supreme law of the land. It has some basic principles: inherent rights, self-government. It's a government by the people, and it separates our powers into branches with different powers. We say we don't want one branch to have more so than others. There's different arguments out there, but that's the philosophy, is that we have three branches that keep each other in check. The three branches are the legislative branch that makes the laws for the nation. That would be Congress. We have the executive branch that provides leadership and enforces the laws. That's the president. And then we have the judicial branch, which explains and interprets the laws, which are the judges. In the federal level, we have the Supreme Court, that then it always goes down through down to the lowest courts. So our U.S. Constitution, again, we have these articles. Legislative powers are granted in the Congress, which is made up of our Senate and our House of Representatives. So they go through processes, if you will, and then they make laws. Again, the book goes into more explanatory ways if you're not exactly sure how this all works, but that's how we make laws, through Congress. And they have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is known as the Commerce Clause. And this is really where they get the authority to pass the laws that impact pharmacy. So the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, for example, this is where they get the authority to do that. So this is one of the most fundamental powers delegated to Congress in the Constitution, is this Commerce Clause. And like I said, this is very important because this is where they get the authority that impacts the pharmacy world, if you will, through many things. So when we say we practice pharmacy and we're involved in the manufacturing, the distribution, the practice of pharmacy, this is where Congress has authority to do things. And again, Article 2 is the executive power, and Article 3 is the judicial power. So we refer to the U.S. Constitution as the supreme law of the land. It basically is, when the Supreme Court decides a case, that's what it is. All judges in every court underneath have to abide by it. It mandates that, that's the decision. So anything that conflicts, it can't. It is the supreme law of the land. So we also have amendments to the U.S. Constitution that have happened since it was adopted. One of them is known as the Bill of Rights. This primarily was concerned with individual freedoms. It was the first 10 amendments, basically. It included things like freedom of speech, religion, the press, and right to jury trials. Amendment 10 had to do with the powers that were not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor did it prohibit it to the states. These were reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Other amendments, one of them was 14. This has to do with the United States, those born and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. And basically, we have what we call privileges, and the states can't deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction of equal protection of the laws. Now, this is for the states. This is known as the due process of states. There's also one for the federal too. And I put it there. It's under the Fifth Amendment. But what we basically have is we have due process of law and we have equal protection. So those are very two important concepts, and it even comes into play for us as a pharmacist because we'll have licenses, and before someone can come and take our licenses away, we typically have to have a hearing or we have the opportunity to be heard. So that's why it's important. So So the branches of government, as I mentioned, we want these separation of powers so one doesn't become too strong, so there's checks and balances. So for example, the legislative branch makes laws, executive branch is the president, the judicial branch is the courts. So Congress can make a law, and if it exceeds its powers, or if it is, doing something that it probably shouldn't be doing, it's unconstitutional, well, then the judges can deem it to be unconstitutional. So that's a check and balance, for example. So again, the judicial branch has this power to evaluate and interpret laws. And if it's constitutional, they'll say it's constitutional. If not, they'll say it's unconstitutional, right? So that's a check for the Congress. So when the judicial branch makes opinions, okay, they're enforceable as law. They're binding on the lowest courts of the same jurisdiction. So you start the lower court, and then you go to the Court of Appeals, right? And if it makes it all the way up to the Supreme Court, which isn't a right to go to the Supreme Court, they have to agree to hear it. But when they put down a decision, that's what we call stare decisis or precedent. So these are decisions made in prior cases that are followed in current cases and will be followed in future cases with the same facts. So as lawyers, what we do is if like you come to me with facts and say, I was a pharmacist and a patient claims that they took a medication and the dose was too high and that I didn't warn them about it. And they're saying because of that they're going to sue me and that I'll be responsible for all the harm that they had. Is that true? So I can go back and I can look at past cases in the same jurisdiction and see if there's any cases like that. And if there is, and if the facts are the same, I can look and see what the holding was. And I can look and say, okay, well, we have a case very similar to yours. Here's the facts, and this is the holding. And that's a precedent, and a precedent's out there. Now, doesn't mean that precedents can't be changed because we've seen even recently in the past year or so, where the Supreme Court has changed precedents from the past. So it doesn't mean everything is carved in stone, but it gives us an idea of what to expect from past cases in the same jurisdiction. If there's no case out there, then maybe we want to go and try and argue something for the court to hold something, and then we're basically developing a precedent. Now, what if something is in a different jurisdiction? We can point to that and say to the court, hey, look how this jurisdiction did it. They don't have to go by that. They can look at it and say, oh, maybe we'll do the same thing as that jurisdiction, right? So it's called precedence or stare decisis. So that is something that is something that lawyers use. Again, but it's lower courts follow higher courts in the same jurisdiction. But again, it's not carved in stone. You can make an argument for the court to break precedent. Okay, so if anyone has any questions up at this point, feel free to write them down. If we see each other next, you can ask, or maybe on a discussion board. So just some brief comments again about national versus state government. So at the federal government, we see the regulation of interstate commerce, which is between the states, and then how the federal government makes laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its powers, where the state government is intrastate, so basically within its jurisdiction, its state, and they do things like issuing licenses so it's like pharmacists, and then they take measures for the public health and safety. So the practice of pharmacy, if you will, is more so regulated at the state government level. So we'll see more of that at the state. So as I mentioned, the federal government, right, they oversee basically the whole country. Every state has its own government too, pretty much structured like the federal government. It has its own constitution. It has its general police powers to protect the public health and safety. It has its own independent authority to issue laws. Now, it cannot conflict with federal laws, though. So we have this hierarchy. We have the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. Then we have our federal statutes. Then we have our state constitutions. We have state legislation. We have ordinances. So we have to think about this. If there's a state law that conflicts with a federal law, the federal law is going to trump it. If we have a state law that, a state law that is stricter, if you will, than a federal law, that's not in conflict. So that's okay. So we're going to look at some examples here to make sure that we get this down, because this is something that does come up in pharmacy practice. I don't want to say a lot, but it comes up enough, and we'll see it throughout law class. So we want to make sure that we understand this. And as you go and you practice, you're going to see that you have to put federal and state laws together. So this is something that you want to make sure that you understand. So let's look at what we have some conflicts here. So we know currently, this might not always be the case, but we currently have conflicts at the state and federal levels with marijuana. This is a really good example. And then there's also some conflicts with assisted suicide at some state levels too. So, at least there used to be. So we can talk about those too, but probably the best example would be marijuana. And then there's some examples where we have state laws that are stricter where they're not conflicts. So just think about this though. Every time you have a difference between state and federal law does not automatically mean it's a conflict, okay? So you have to ask some questions. So for example, in Pennsylvania, for example, I'll just give you a Pennsylvania example because this is, where I'm licensed and I practice. You have a Schedule 5 cough syrup that is a prescription requiring drug in Pennsylvania. But at the federal level, it does not require a prescription. So, and that's because the state law requires it, but the federal law does not. So they're different, right? But Pennsylvania law is stricter than federal law. So, but they can coexist because the federal law is less strict. Pennsylvania just says, hey, you have to have a prescription. But by practicing in Pennsylvania requiring a prescription, I'm not violating the federal law. Okay, so when you look at the hierarchy of things, the federal law is above the state law. Okay, I'm not conflicting with the federal law by following the state law. Okay. So let's take another one. State X requires you to counsel on every prescription. The federal law only requires you to offer to counsel. So state X is actually stricter than the federal law. So again, by counseling on every prescription, you're actually doing something stricter than the federal law. So you're not violating the federal law every time you go and counsel. You're actually going above it. Okay. But if it was flip side of that and the state only required you to offer, but the federal law said you had to counsel, by just offering, you're actually not meeting the federal law. So you're actually in conflict there. So if it was flip side of that, it would be a conflict. But the way it's currently structured, it's okay. The state is just stricter. The non-safety cap example is the federal law requires that every prescription you dispense have to have a non-safety cap. I mean, there are some exceptions, but just in general, that's it. If your state says that you don't have to, then that's a conflict, okay? Because by not putting a safety cap on, you're violating the federal law. So the questions you need to ask is, can I complete the task at hand and comply with both state and federal law? Okay, hopefully they're the same, okay, or they're, close enough that they're the same. But if it's no, then you have to say, well, if I comply with federal but not state, okay, is state the law stricter? If yes, then these laws can coexist and you can follow them. But if you comply with state law but not federal law in the process, then this is a conflict, okay? So, again, you want to make sure that you are not violating federal law because that's the concern in the hierarchy. So, again, look at the hierarchy. Federal law trumps state law, so that's a concern. So the marijuana issue right now is that many states make it legal or they allow it to a certain level medicinally or recreationally without criminal charges, but it's still a Schedule 1 at the federal level, which is illegal. So that's clearly a conflict of law. States allowing it where the federal law does not. Now, this might change in the future, but currently this is where we're still at. So anyone using it in any state currently is actually going against federal law. Now, the federal government is out there prosecuting people. No, they decided not to do that, but it is still a conflict with federal law. So administrative agencies, we consider this like the fourth branch of government. They are created under the laws that they're enforcing or that they are um, implementing. So for example, the FDA is under the Food Drug Cosmetic Act, for example. It enforces it and it passes rules and regulations thereunder. That's an administrative agency. So, but they're there to do those particular fine-tuned things under that law, because the legislator that passed the Food Drug Cosmetic Act usually aren't experts to do the things needed. So the FDA, under the Food Drug Cosmetic Act, they pass the rules and regulations, but they are not the legislator. They are not the ones that are voted in to pass the laws. Other examples would be the Department of Justice, the DEA at the federal level, your state board of pharmacy at the state level. So what does this mean all to you? So we have our federal and our state involvement of healthcare. We have to mingle these all together, make sure that we understand how they all fit together. We're going to have federal laws we have to follow. We're going to have state laws we have to follow. Sometimes we're going to have federal and state laws to worry about on the same topic. For example, controlled substances. We have a federal controlled substance law. We're going to have a state controlled substance law. Very common. They're going to talk to the same things at the same time. Sometimes they're going to be the same. Sometimes they're going to be different. We're going to have to worry about how to follow those. Okay. We have Congress, we have Constitution, right? I talked about how these constitutional things give Congress the authority. I also talked about how the states have police power, so they still retain rights over us as well too. We also know what laws we have to follow, again, federal and state. We have important role of administrative agencies. We have the FDA, the DEA, we have our state boards of pharmacy. We also know that case law is important for us too. They can determine what our role in healthcare is based on past cases within that jurisdiction, but we also know other jurisdictions may be authoritative for other jurisdictions to look at. However, precedence isn't carved in stone because it can be overturned, and we've seen that. We also know in particular that pharmacy law helps us determine what the basic requirements are for day-to-day practice, and they give us our minimal standards. However, we don't want to confuse that with good professional judgment or ethics. We can always go above it. It's just, this is our minimal standards. I call it the floor. You want to be standing on it, but you can reach for the ceiling or the sky. So for example, if it says you have to offer counseling in the law or the rules, then you have to offer counseling to the patients. However, if you want to make it your priority to make sure that you counsel every patient and go above the law, then that's fine. But that's up to you. You only have to offer counseling in terms of a legal requirement. Do not confuse this with work policies, because your employers will have policies to follow. Oftentimes policies are what the law is, because they have to obviously meet what the law is, but oftentimes they exceed what the law is, okay? So don't automatically assume whatever your policy is at work is what the law is, okay? So for example, when you get a question on my exam or on the MPJE or whatever your state law test is, you don't want to just say, oh, this is what my work does, right? No, you want to make sure you're answering based on what the law is, okay? So make sure you consider that. So you're going to have employee handbooks, you're going to have policies that you have to follow, right? But at the same time, you also want to make sure you understand what the law is as well too. Now, these work policies provide details on the operations of the company and what the requirements are there. And again, that might incorporate what the law is and stuff, and it might be stricter, and that's up to the company. That's fine. Can't be less strict than what the law and the rules are, though, obviously. So, for example, your company may require you to store C2s in a safe, but a state law may actually allow you to disperse them amongst the regular stock, for example. Okay? Now there's a little section in the textbook and in the required readings that talks about civil, administrative, and criminal law. And if you're taking the law class and you've had me in other courses, I've actually already talked about this, but civil legal cases have to do with a private party suing another party, typically for money or for some type of injunction to stop something. Common one would be malpractice, where the patient sues someone else or a company claiming that they were harmed for something done wrong. So malpractice because of a pharmacy or a pharmacist maybe doing a misfill, for example, and they were harmed. Other things would be like a breach of contract or defamation would be another example. That's a civil case. Administrative would be an administrative action. An example here would be like the Board of Pharmacy taking administrative action against your license. Harm is not a required element of these administrative actions. You have to violate a standard such as the Pharmacy Act or Board of Pharmacy Rule or Regulation. DEA is administrative agency too, so if they go after the registrant, such as the pharmacy, that's another example. That's administrative action. And a criminal action would be where there's a criminal statute, and then the enforcing one would be like the government that enforces that statute. And the penalties are usually fines and or jail. And typically there's an intent that has to be met, an intent level that has to be met to be found guilty of a crime. All right, so again, any questions throughout, write them down, jot them down, and then we can talk about them whenever we meet or whether or not we have discussion boards. So again, for exam purposes, if you're in the pharmacy law course for chapter 1, given it again does not specifically cover pharmacy content in depth. But rather background, legal structure, government information like that. There's going to be limited exam questions from this chapter. Again, depending on how many test questions there are, there'll just be a few or a handful. So content will be focused on the topics that are covered on these slides, such as conflict of law, such as stare decisis precedent, okay, so whatever topics are on these slides. The assigned supplemental readings from the text are going to be from the following headings: sources of law. Now, under there are the subheadings, one of them including distinguishing criminal, civil, and administrative law, which I had a slide on as well. And then the other heading is federal versus state law as well. So just a few pages of reading from the text. And then recall, after those sections, there's going to be some takeaway points as well. And then there's also some study scenarios after those sections too. So not a lot of reading in there. Now there's additional reading in that chapter. You're more than welcome to read it if you want. That talks about these topics. You don't have to. But the required readings from this textbook, which supplement these slides, are sources of law and federal versus state.